Hey, boys and girls. I'm going to start a chapter book, and this one is really intended for maybe second grade on up through fifth grade. The older kids will really appreciate it a lot more and catch the meanings, the hidden meanings in the story. This is C.S. Lewis's book called The Magician's Nephew, and I need to explain a little bit. A lot of you have probably seen the Disney version movies that have come out. They're very well done, and they follow a different order. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was actually the first book that C.S. Lewis wrote in the Chronicles of Narnia series. In the British edition, he has the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Prince Caspian was number 2. And I think the third one was The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And that's the way Disney has decided to come out with the movies, in that order. But later in his life, in his work, C.S. Lewis, he wanted to tell where Narnia began, or how it began. And in the movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, one of the most frightening characters is the White Witch. And where did she come from? How did she get into Narnia? So he actually wrote this book 5 years later after he finished the Chronicles of Narnia, book number 1. But in the American editions, HarperCollins, which is the publisher of these books now in America, they renumbered all of the books. And they put this book, The Magician's Nephew, as book number 1. It was actually written as a prequel so you could find out where Narnia came from. And it'll explain some of the maybe mysteries from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which in our new edition is actually book number 2. So I hope you'll enjoy this story. It's a long book, so I'm going to have to do it in chunks. I'm going to give you the first part of The Magician's Nephew right now. From the Chronicles of Narnia series, book number 1, The Magician's Nephew, by C.S. Lewis, illustrated by Pauline Baines, published by HarperCollins Publishers, copyright 1955. Chapter 1, The Wrong Door. This is a story about something that happened long ago when your grandfather was a child. It is a very important story because it shows how all the comings and goings between our own world and the land of Narnia first began. In those days, Mr. Sherlock Holmes was still living in Baker Street, and the Bastables were looking for treasure in the Lewisham Road. In those days, if you were a boy, you had to wear a stiff Eton collar every day, and schools were usually nastier than now. But meals were nicer, and as for sweets, I won't tell you how cheap and good they were, because it would only make your mouth water in vain. And in those days, there lived in London a girl named Polly Plummer. She lived in one of a long row of houses which were all joined together. One morning, she was out in the back garden when a boy scrambled up from the garden next door and put his face over the wall. Polly was very surprised because, up until now, there had never been any children in that house, but only Mr. Ketterly and Miss Ketterly, a brother and sister, an old bachelor and an old maid living together. So she looked up, full of curiosity. The face of the strange boy was very grubby. It could hardly have been grubbier if he had first rubbed his hands in the earth and then had a good cry and then dried his face with his hands. As a matter of fact, this was very nearly what he had been doing. "Hello," said Polly. "Hello," said the boy. "What's your name?" "Polly," said Polly. "What's yours?" "Digory," said the boy. "I say, what a funny name," said Polly. "Well, it isn't half so funny as Polly," said Digory. "Yes, it is," said Polly. "No, it isn't," said Digory. "Well, at any rate, I do wash my face," said Polly, "which is what you need to do, especially after—" And then she stopped. She had been going to say, "after you've been blubbering," but she thought that wouldn't be very polite. "All right, I have then," said Digory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't even care who knew he had been crying. "And so would you," he went on, "if you'd lived all your life out in the country, and you had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this." "London isn't a hole," said Polly indignantly. But the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and so he went on. And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, crazy, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and your mother was ill and was going to die. And then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does when you're trying to keep back your tears. "Oh, I didn't know. I'm sorry," said Polly humbly. And then, because she hardly knew what to say, and also to turn Digory's mind to more cheerful subjects, she asked, Is Mr. Ketterly really mad?" "Well, he's either mad," said Digory, or there's some other mystery. He has a study on the top floor of his house, and Aunt Letty says I must never, ever go up there. Well, that looks fishy to begin with. And then there's another thing. Whenever he tries to say anything to me at meal times, he never even tries to talk to her. Well, she always shuts him up. She says, "Don't worry the boy, Andrew," or "I'm sure Digory doesn't want to hear about that," or else, "Now, Digory, wouldn't you just like to go out and play in the garden?" Well, what sort of things does he try to say? I don't know. He never gets far enough. But there's more than that. One night, it was last night, in fact, as I was going past the foot of the attic stairs on my way to bed, and I don't much care for going past those stairs either, I'm sure I heard a yell. Well, perhaps he keeps a crazy wife shut up in there. Yeah, I thought of that. Or perhaps he's a coiner. Or he might have been a pirate, like the man at the beginning of Treasure Island, and be always hiding from his old shipmates. Ooh, how exciting, said Polly. I never knew your house was so interesting. You may think it's interesting, said Digory, but you wouldn't like it if you had to sleep there. How would you like to lie awake, listening for Uncle Andrew's step to come creeping along the passage to your room? And he has such awful eyes. Now that was how Polly and Digory got to know one another. And as it was just the beginning of the summer holidays, summer vacation, and neither of them was going to the sea that year, they met nearly every day. Their adventures began chiefly because it was one of the wettest and coldest summers there had been for years. That drove them to do indoor things, you might say, like indoor exploration. It is wonderful how much exploring you can do with a little stump of a candle in a big old house or in a row of houses. Polly had discovered long ago that if you opened a certain little door in the box room attic of her house, you would find the cistern and a dark place behind it, which you could get into by a little bit of careful climbing. Now, the dark place, it was like a long tunnel with brick wall on one side and a sloping roof on the other. In the roof, there were little chunks of light between the slate shingles. There was no floor in this tunnel. You see, you had to be careful. You had to step from rafter to rafter. And between them, there was only plaster. So if you stepped on this, you would find yourself falling through the ceiling of the room below. Now, Polly, you see, she had used the bit of the tunnel just beside the cistern tank as a smuggler's cave. She had brought up bits of old packing cases and the seats of broken kitchen chairs and things of that sort, and she spread them across from one rafter to the other rafter, to make a bit of a floor for her. Here she kept a cash box containing various treasures and a story she was writing, and usually there's a few apples. She had often drunk a quiet bottle of ginger ale in there. The old bottles made it look more like a smuggler's cave. Digory, he quite liked this cave. Well, she wouldn't let him see the story she was writing, but he was more interested in the exploring. Look here, he said. How long does this tunnel go on for? I mean, does it stop where your house ends? No, said Polly. The walls don't go out to the roof. It just goes on and on. I don't know how far. You mean then we could get down the whole length of the whole row of houses? Yeah, I guess so we could, said Polly. And, I say, what? I believe we could actually get into the other houses. Yeah, and get taken up for burglars? No thanks. Oh, don't be so jolly clever. I was thinking of the house beyond yours. Yeah, what about it? Why, that house, it's an empty one. Daddy says it's always been empty ever since we came here. Well, I suppose we ought to have a look at it then, said Digory. He was a good deal more excited than you would have thought from the way he spoke. For, of course, he was thinking, just as you would have been too, of all the reasons why that house might have been empty for so long. And so was Polly. Neither of them said the word haunted, and both felt that once the thing had been suggested, it would be, well, feeble not to do it. Shall we go and try it now? Said Digory. All right, said Polly. Well, you don't have to if you'd rather not, said Digory. Hmm? I'm game if you are, she said. Well, how are we to know when we're in the next house? And then the next one? They decided they would have to go out into the box room and walk across it, taking steps as long as the steps from one rafter to the next one. That would give them an idea of how many rafters went to one room. Then they would allow about, four more for the passage between the two attics in Polly's house, and then the same number for the maid's bedroom, and as for the box room. That would give them the whole entire length of one house. Well, when they had done that distance twice, well, then they would know that they were at the end of Digory's house. So any door they came to after that, why, that would let them into the attic of the empty house. But I don't expect it's really empty at all, said Digory. Oh, what do you expect? I expect someone lives there in secret, only coming in and out at night with a dark lantern. We shall probably discover a gang of desperate criminals, and we can get a reward. It's all rot to say that a house would be empty all those years unless there was some mystery. Well, my daddy thought it was probably because the drains were clogged up, said Polly. Ah, pooh. Grown-ups are always thinking of uninteresting explanations, said Digory. Now that they were talking by daylight in the attic instead of candlelight in the smuggler's cave, it seemed much less likely that the empty house would be haunted. So when they had measured the attic, they had to get a pencil and then do their sums. They both got different answers to it at first, and even when they finally agreed, I am not sure that they got it exactly right. They were in a hurry to start on their exploration. We mustn't make a sound, said Polly as they climbed in again behind the old cistern tank. Because it was such an important occasion, they took a candle each. Polly had a good store of these in her cave. It was very dark and dusty and drafty, and they stepped from rafter to rafter without a word, except when they whispered to one another. We're opposite of your attic now. Or, this must be halfway through our house. And neither of them stumbled, and the candles didn't go out, and at last they came to where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. Now there was no bolt to lock it, or a handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as there often is inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn it. Shall I do it? Said Digory. I'm game if you are, said Polly, just as she had said before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. They weren't going to turn back now. Digory pushed round the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. Then, with a great shock, they saw that they were looking not into a deserted attic, but into a very well furnished room. But it seemed empty enough. It was dead silent. Polly's curiosity got the better of her. She blew out her candle and stepped out into this strange room, making no more noise than a mouse. It was shaped, of course, like an attic, but it was furnished just like a sitting room or a library. Every bit of the walls was lined with shelves, and every bit of the shelves was full of books. A fire was burning in the grate. You remember it was very cold, wet summer that year. And in front of the fireplace, with its back towards them, was a high-backed armchair. Between the chair and Polly, and filling most of the middle of the room, was a big table. It was piled with all sorts of things. Printed books, books of the sort that you write in, like a journal, and ink bottles and pens and sealing wax, and there was even a microscope. But what she noticed first was a bright red wooden tray with a number of rings on it. The rings were in pairs, a yellow one and a green one together. Then a little bit of space, and then another yellow one and another green one. They were no bigger than ordinary rings, and no one could help noticing them because they were just so bright. They were the most beautiful, shiny little things you can imagine. If Polly had been a very little younger, I think she would have wanted to put one in her mouth. The room was so quiet that you noticed the ticking of the clock at once. And yet, as she now found, it was not absolutely quiet either. There was a very faint, very, very faint humming sound. You see, if vacuum cleaners had been invented back in those days, Polly would have thought it was the sound of a Hoover vacuum being worked a long way off, several rooms away and several floors below. But it was a nicer sound than that. It was a more musical tone, only so faint that you could hardly even hear it. It's all right. There's no one here, said Polly. And she said it over her shoulder to Digory. She was speaking above a whisper now, and Digory came out, blinking and looking extremely dirty, as indeed Polly was too. This is no good, he said. This is not an empty house at all. We'd better leave before anyone comes. What do you think those are? Said Polly, and she pointed at the colored rings. Oh, come on, said Digory. The sooner... He never finished what he was going to say, for at that very moment something happened. That high-backed chair that was in front of the fireplace, it moved suddenly, and there rose up out of it, like a pantomime demon coming up out of a trap door, the alarming form of Uncle Andrew. They were not in the empty house at all. They were in Digory's house, and they were upstairs in the forbidden study. Both children said, "Oh!" and they realized their terrible mistake. They felt they ought to have known all along that they hadn't gone nearly far enough. Well, Uncle Andrew, he was tall, very thin. He had a long, clean-shaven face with a very sharply pointed nose and extremely bright eyes and a great tousled mop of gray hair. Digory was quite speechless, for Uncle Andrew looked 1,000 times more alarming than he had ever looked before. Polly, Polly was not so frightened yet, but she soon was, for the very first thing Uncle Andrew did was to walk across to the door of the room, and he shut it, and he turned the key in the lock. Then he turned around, fixed the children with his bright eyes, and he smiled, showing all of his teeth. "There," he said, "now my fool of a sister can't get at you." It was dreadfully unlike anything a grown-up would be expected to do. Polly's heart came up into her mouth, and she and Digory started backing towards the little door that they had come in by. Uncle Andrew was too quick for them. He got behind them and shut that door too, and he stood right in front of it. Then he rubbed his hands, made his knuckles crack. He had very long, beautiful white fingers. "I am delighted to see you," he said. "Two children are just what I wanted." "Please, please, Mr. Ketterly," said Polly. "It's nearly my dinner time, and I've got to go home. Will you let us out, please?" "Not just yet," said Uncle Andrew. "This is too good an opportunity to miss. I wanted two children. You see, I'm in the middle of a great experiment. I've tried it on a guinea pig, and it seemed to work. But then, of course, a guinea pig can't tell you anything, and you can't explain to it how to come back." "Look here, Uncle Andrew," said Digory. It really is dinner time, and they'll be looking for us in a moment. You must let us out." "Must?" said Uncle Andrew. Digory and Polly glanced at one another. They dared not say anything, but the glances meant, "Isn't this dreadful?" and "I guess we must humor him." If you let us go for our dinner now," said Polly, "we could come right back right after dinner." "Oh, but how do I know that you would?" said Uncle Andrew with a cunning smile. And then he seemed to change his mind. Well, he said, "if you really must go, I suppose you must. I can't expect two youngsters like you to find it much fun talking to an old buffer like me." And he sighed as he went on. "You've no idea how lonely I sometimes am. But no matter. Go to your dinner. I must give you a present before you go. It's not every day that I see a little girl in my dingy old study, especially, if I may say so, such a very attractive young lady as yourself." Polly began to think maybe he might not really be that mad and crazy after all. "Wouldn't you like a ring, my dear?" said Uncle Andrew to Polly. Do you mean one of those yellow or green ones?" said Polly. How lovely." "Not a green one," said Uncle Andrew. "I'm afraid I can't give the green ones away. But I'd be delighted to give you any of the yellow ones, with my love. Come and try one on." Polly had now quite gotten over her fright, and she felt sure that this old gentleman was not mad, and there was certainly something strangely attractive about those bright rings. She moved over to the tray. "Why, I declare," she said, "that humming noise gets louder over here. It's almost as if the rings were making it." "What a funny fancy, my dear," said Uncle Andrew with a laugh. It sounded a very natural laugh, but Digory had seen an eager, almost like a greedy look on his face. "Polly, don't be a fool," he shouted. "Don't touch them." But it was too late. Exactly as he spoke, Polly's hand went out to touch one of the rings. And immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of any sort, there was no Polly. Digory and his uncle were all alone in the room. Chapter 2. Digory and his uncle. It was so sudden and so horribly unlike anything that had ever happened to Digory, even in a nightmare. He let out a scream. Instantly, Uncle Andrew's hand went over his mouth. "None of that," he hissed in Digory's ear. "If you start making a noise, your mother will hear it, and you know what a fright might do to her." As Digory said afterward, the horrible meanness of getting at a chap in that way, it almost made him sick. But of course he didn't do it. He didn't scream again. "That's better," said Uncle Andrew. "Perhaps you couldn't help it. It is a shock when you first see someone vanish. Why, it gave me a turn when the guinea pig did it the other night." "What was that? Was that when you yelled?" asked Digory. Oh, you heard that, did you? I hope you haven't been spying on me." "No, I haven't," said Digory stubbornly. But what's happened to Polly?" "Congratulate me, dear boy," said Uncle Andrew, rubbing his hands. "My experiment has succeeded. The little girl's gone, vanished, right out of the world." What have you done to her?" "Sent her to another place." What do you mean?" asked Digory. Uncle Andrew sat down and said, "Well, I'll tell you all about it. Have you ever heard of old Mrs. LeFay?" Wasn't she a great aunt or something?" said Digory. "Not exactly," said Uncle Andrew. "She was my godmother. That's her, there, over on the wall." Digory looked. He saw a faded photograph. It showed the face of an old woman wearing a bonnet. And he could now remember that he had once seen a photo of the same face in an old drawer at home out in the country. He had asked Mother who it was, and Mother had not seemed to want to talk about that subject much. It was not at all a nice face, Digory thought, though of course with those early photographs, well, no one could never really tell. Was there something wrong about her, Uncle Andrew?" he said. "Well," said Uncle Andrew with a little chuckle, "it depends on what you call wrong. Some people are so narrow-minded. Now, she certainly got very strange in later life. She did very unwise things. That was why they shut her up. In an asylum, do you mean? Oh, no, said Uncle Andrew in a shocked voice. No, nothing of that sort. She was only put in a prison. I say, said Digory, what had she done? Ah, poor woman, said Uncle Andrew. She had been very unwise. There were a good many different things. We needn't go into all that. She was always very kind to me, though. But look here, what has all of this got to do with Polly? I do wish you'd... All in good time, my boy, said Uncle Andrew. They let old Mrs. LeFay out before she died. And I was one of the very few people whom she would allow to see her in her last illness. She had got to dislike ordinary, ignorant people, you understand. I do myself, but she and I were interested in the same sort of things. It was only a few days before her death that she told me to go to an old bureau in her house and open a secret drawer and bring her a little box that I would find there. The moment I picked up that box, I could tell by the pricking in my fingers that I held some great secret in my hands. She gave it to me and made me promise that as soon as she was dead, I would burn it, unopened, with certain ceremonies. That promise I did not keep. Well, then, that was jolly rotten of you, said Digory. Rotten? Said Uncle Andrew with a puzzled look. Oh, I see. You mean that little boys ought to keep their promises? Very true. Most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you have been taught to do it. But of course you must understand that rules of that sort, however excellent they may be for little boys and servants and women and even people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages like me. No, Digory, men like me who possess hidden wisdom are freed from common rules, just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. As he said this, he sighed, and then he looked so grave and noble and mysterious that, well, for a second, Digory really thought he was saying something rather fine. But then he remembered the ugly look he had seen on his uncle's face the moment before Polly had vanished, and all at once he saw through Uncle Andrew's grand words. All it means, he said to himself, is that he thinks he can do anything he likes to get anything he wants. Now, of course, said Uncle Andrew, I didn't dare to open the box for a long time, for I knew it might contain something highly dangerous. For my godmother was a very remarkable woman. The truth is, she was one of the last mortals in this country who had fairy blood in her. Now, she said there had been two others in her time. One was a duchess, and the other was an old charwoman. In fact, Digory, you are now talking to the last man, possibly, who really had a fairy godmother. There, that'll be something for you to remember when you are an old man yourself. I bet she was a bad fairy, thought Digory, and added out loud, but what about Polly? Oh, how you do harp upon that, said Uncle Andrew, as if that was what mattered. My first task was, of course, to study the box itself. It was very ancient, and I knew enough even then to know that it wasn't Greek, or Old Egyptian, or Babylonian, or Hittite, or Chinese. It was older than any of those nations. Ah, that was a great day when I at last found out the truth. The box was Atlantean. It came from the lost island of Atlantis. That meant it was centuries older than any of those Stone Age things that they dig up in Europe. And it wasn't a rough, crude thing like them either. For in the very dawn of time, Atlantis was already a great city with palaces, temples, and learned men. He paused for a moment, as if he expected Digory to say something. But Digory was disliking his uncle more and more every minute, so he said nothing. Meanwhile, continued Uncle Andrew, I was learning a good deal in other ways. It wouldn't be proper to explain them to a child. I was learning about magic in general. That meant that I came to have a fair idea what sort of things might be in the box. By various tests, I narrowed down the possibilities. I had to get to know some devilish, strange people. And I had to go through some very disagreeable experiences. That was what turned my head gray. One doesn't become a magician for nothing. My health broke down in the end, but I got better. And at last, I actually knew. Although there was not really the least chance of anyone overhearing them, he leaned forward and he almost whispered as he said, "The Atlantean box contains something that had been brought from another world when our world was only just beginning." "What?" asked Digory, who was now interested in spite of himself. "Only dust," said Uncle Andrew. "Fine, dry dust. Nothing much to look at. Not much to show for a lifetime of toil, you might say. Ah, but when I looked at that dust, I took a jolly good care not to touch it. And I thought that every grain had once been in another world. I don't mean another planet, you know. No. The planets, they're part of our world. And you could get to them if you went far enough. But I mean, really, another world, another nature, another universe. Somewhere you would never reach, even if you traveled through the space of this universe forever and ever. A world that could be reached only by magic. Well, here Uncle Andrew rubbed his hands till his knuckles cracked just like fireworks. I knew, he went on, that if only you could get it into the right form, that dust would draw you back to the place where it had come from. But the difficulty was to get it into the right form. My earlier experiments were all failures. I tried them on guinea pigs. Some of them only died. Some exploded like little bombs. Oh, that's a jolly cruel thing to do, said Digory, who had once had a pet guinea pig of his very own. Well, how do you keep getting off the point? Said Uncle Andrew. That's what the creatures were for. I bought them myself. Now let me see, where was I? Oh, yes, yeah. At last I succeeded in making the rings, the yellow rings. But now a new difficulty arose. I was pretty sure now that a yellow ring would send any creature that touched it into the other place. But what would be the good of that if I couldn't get them back to tell me what they had found there? And what about them? Said Digory. A nice mess they'd be in if they couldn't get back. You will keep on looking at everything from the wrong point of view, said Uncle Andrew with a look of impatience. Can't you understand that the thing is a great experiment? The whole point of sending anyone into the other place is that I want to find out what it's like. Well, why didn't you just go yourself then? Digory had hardly ever seen anyone look so surprised and offended as his uncle did at this simple question. Me? Me? He exclaimed. The boy! Oh, this boy must be mad. A man at my time of life and in my state of health to risk the shock and the dangers of being flung suddenly into a different universe? I never heard anything so preposterous in my life. Do you realize what you are saying? Think what another world means. You might meet anything there. And I suppose you've sent Polly into it then, said Digory, who his cheeks were flaming red with anger now. And all I can say, he added, even if you are my uncle, is that you've behaved like a coward. You're a coward, sending a girl to a place you're afraid to go to yourself. Silence, sir, said Uncle Andrew, bringing his hand down on the table. I will not be talked to like that by a little dirty schoolboy. You don't understand. I am the great scholar. I am a magician. I am the adept. I am the one who is doing the experiment. Of course, I need subjects to do it on. Bless my soul, you'll be telling me next that I ought to have asked the guinea pigs' permission before I used them. No great wisdom can be reached without sacrifice. But the idea of my going myself, that's ridiculous. It's like asking a general to fight as a common soldier. Well, supposing I got killed, what would become of my life's work? Oh, do stop jawing, said Digory. Are you going to bring Polly back? Well, I was going to tell you when you so rudely interrupted me, said Uncle Andrew, that I did at last find out a way of doing the return journey. The green rings draw you back. But Polly doesn't have a green ring. No, said Uncle Andrew with a cruel smile. But then she can't get back, shouted Digory. And it's exactly the same as if you murdered her. She can get back, said Uncle Andrew, if someone else would go after her, wearing a yellow ring himself, and taking 2 green rings, one to bring himself back and one to bring her back. And now, of course, Digory saw the trap in which he was caught. And he stared at Uncle Andrew, saying nothing, with his mouth wide open. His cheeks had gone very, very pale. "I hope," said Uncle Andrew, presently in a very high and mighty voice, just as if he were a perfect uncle who had given one a handsome tip and some good advice. "I hope, Digory, you are not given to showing the white feather. I should be very sorry to think that anyone in our family did not have enough honor and chivalry to go to the aid of a lady in distress." "Oh, shut up," said Digory. "If you had any honor at all, that you'd be going yourself. But I know you won't do it. All right, I see I've got to go. But you are a beast. I suppose you planned the whole thing so that she'd go without knowing it, and then I'd have to go after her." "Of course," said Uncle Andrew, with that hateful smile. "Very well, I'll go, but there's one thing I jolly well mean to say first. I didn't believe in magic till today. I see now that it's real. Well, if it is, I suppose all the old fairy tales are more or less true, and you're simply a wicked, cruel magician like the ones in all those stories. Well, I've never read a story in which people of that sort weren't paid out in the end. Gotten what they deserved. And I bet you'll be too. And it will serve you right." Of all the things Digory had said, well, this was the very first that really set home with him. Uncle Andrew started, and there came a look over his face, a look of such horror that, beast though he was, you could almost feel sorry for him. But a second later, he smoothed it all away, and he said with a rather forced laugh, well, I suppose that in a natural thing for a child to think up, brought up among women as you have been, old wives' tales, I don't think you need to worry about my danger, Digory. Wouldn't it be better for you to worry about the danger of your little friend? She's been gone some time. If there are any dangers over there, well, it would be a pity to arrive a moment too late." "Oh, a lot you care," said Digory fiercely. "But I'm sick of this jawing. What have I got to do?" You must really learn to control that temper of yours, my boy," said Uncle Andrew coolly. "Otherwise, you'll grow up to be just like your Aunt Letty. Now, listen to me." He got up. He put on a pair of gloves, walked over to the tray that contained the rings. "They only work," he said, "if they're actually touching your skin. Wearing gloves, I can pick them up, like this, and nothing happens. If you carried one in your pocket, nothing would happen. But of course, you'd have to be careful not to put your hand in your pocket and touch it by accident, because the moment you touch a yellow ring, you vanish out of this world. Now, when you are in the other place, I expect, of course, this hasn't been tested yet, But I expect that the moment you touch a green ring, you will vanish out of that world, and I expect you to reappear in this world. Now, I take these two greens and drop them into your right hand pocket. Remember, very carefully, which pocket the greens are in. G for green, R for right. GR, you see, green, which are the first two letters of the word green. One for you and one for the little girl. And now you pick up a yellow one for yourself, and I should put it on your finger if I were you. There'll be less chance of dropping it. Digory had almost picked up the yellow ring when he suddenly checked himself. "Look here," he said. "What about Mother? Supposing she asks where I am?" "Well, the sooner you go, the sooner you'll be back," said Uncle Andrew cheerfully. "But you don't really know whether I can get back." Uncle Andrew shrugged his shoulders, walked across to the door, unlocked it, threw it open, and said, "Oh, very well then. Just as you please. Just go down and you can go have your dinner. Leave that little girl to be eaten by wild animals, or drowned, or starved in the other world, or lost there for good, if that's what you prefer. It's all the same to me. Perhaps before tea time you'd better drop in on Mrs. Plummer and explain that she will never see her daughter again because you were afraid to put on a ring." "Oh, by gum," said Digory, "don't I wish I was big enough to punch your head." Then he buttoned up his coat, took a deep breath. He picked up the ring, and he thought then, as he always thought afterward too, that he could not decently have done anything else.